I fought my brother over my father's $2 million estate, but ended up sending him to prison for tax fraud. This is a story about greed, betrayal, and the cold, hard reality of the probate system in America. For years, my brother convinced himself he deserved everything my father built. When Dad passed away, my brother executed his plan flawlessly. He successfully stole over $2 million in assets that were rightfully mine. The court wouldn't help me, the lawyers told me to walk away. But I refused. I didn't get my inheritance back through a simple lawsuit. I got justice through an obscure piece of federal law. My brother didn't go to jail for the theft of my father's estate. He went to federal prison for tax fraud. Let's call my brother Mark. Mark was the quintessential middle child, entitled, charming when he needed to be, and convinced the world owed him something. My father, bless his soul, was a self-made man. He started with nothing and built a successful regional construction firm. By the time he retired, he had an impressive $2 million estate, primarily wrapped up in a diversified trust fund and a stunning piece of community property real estate. My relationship with my father was solid. We ran the numbers together. I helped him with his financial planning. I was a successful and slightly paranoid software engineer, and I understood the value of legal certainty. Dad made it clear. Everything was to be split 50-50 between Mark and me. He even showed me the original will and the trust documents years ago. It was airtight. Mark, meanwhile, was a leech. He jumped from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. He constantly pressured Dad for money, claiming he needed capital for his next big venture. Dad always bailed him out, but he knew Mark was unreliable. That's why the original will named me as the primary executor of the estate, not Mark. Everything was set in stone, until it wasn't. My father died quickly last year after a sudden heart attack. It was devastating. The funeral was a blur. Mark showed up, strangely composed, offering me weak condolences. I didn't suspect a thing. A week after the burial, we were required to meet with the family lawyer to begin the probate process, the formal legal process of proving the will is valid and distributing the assets. I was ready to step into my role as executor and handle the paperwork as planned. But when we sat down with Mr. Henderson, the lawyer shuffled a new stack of papers. Mark had filed a new will. This new document, dated just 2 months before Dad's death, completely reversed the original plan. It stated that Mark was now the sole executor, and it stipulated that I would receive a single lump sum payment of $100,000 and the remaining assets, the house, the trust fund, everything, going directly to Mark. I remember my blood running cold. I looked at Mark. He just gave me this practiced, innocent shrug, like he was just as surprised. I immediately shouted for the lawyer to contest the will. I showed him the old documents, the handwritten notes from my father, confirming the 50-50 split. Mr. Henderson shook his head. He pointed out 2 signatures on the new will, legally required witnesses, and the stamp of a notary public. The lawyer explained the brutal reality of probate law. OP, this new will on the surface appears valid. It was properly executed, it was witnessed. If you want to challenge it, you will face an uphill battle. You'll spend 6 figures fighting in probate court, and the burden of proof will be entirely on you to prove your father lacked the mental capacity to sign it, or that Mark exerted undue influence. Proving undue influence is almost impossible in these cases. Mark could simply claim Dad had a change of heart after I became too successful. I was stuck. Mark had played the system perfectly. He had spent maybe a few $1,000s getting this fake will notarized, and now he was walking away with over $1.9 million of my inheritance. Mark even had the audacity to send me a text later that night. "Sorry, little bro, looks like Dad finally saw who deserved it. Take the $100,000 and be happy." I spent the next week in a state of absolute fury. I almost signed the papers and took the $100,000 just to make the pain stop. But the image of Mark smugly texting me while I grieved pushed me over the edge. I realized I couldn't fight Mark on the estate law. He had secured his legal high ground. But as a software engineer who lived and breathed logic, I knew every complex system has a vulnerability. Mark had focused entirely on the probate court. He forgot about the bigger, more unforgiving system, the federal government. If he was going to successfully steal $1.9 million in assets, he was going to have to file paperwork with the IRS reporting how he acquired that money. And the one thing Mark had never understood was the terrifying complexity of inheritance tax law. I pivoted my focus from civil justice to criminal justice. I realized I didn't need a probate lawyer, I needed an IRS forensic accountant. After my initial fury subsided, I realized two things. First, fighting Mark in probate court was a waste of time and money. Second, Mark didn't win because he was smart. He won because he was a reckless idiot who only saw one finish line. He secured the inheritance but completely ignored the massive tax liability that came with it. My first move wasn't to hire a lawyer specializing in wills, it was to find a forensic accountant with experience battling the IRS. I found Jane, a brilliant accountant who looked more like a librarian than a tax auditor. I laid out the whole scenario: the suspicious, late-filed will, the $1.9 million transfer, and Mark's general financial illiteracy. Jane immediately zeroed in on the weakness. She explained that when an estate transfers assets, the value is reported to the IRS. Mark had become the executor, and therefore he was responsible for filing the final tax returns for the estate. If he incorrectly classified the $1.9 million, say by claiming it was a non-taxable gift instead of inheritance, or by grossly undervaluing the community property real estate, that was a federal offense. We needed a clear paper trail, and Mark was foolish enough to provide one. I instructed Jane to start digging into the public records, focusing on Mark's declarations regarding the estate's assets. Mark's filing was a mess. He had rushed to sell off some of the smaller investment accounts to cover immediate debts, and in doing so, he had failed to correctly report the capital gains. He was trying to bypass the federal estate tax by claiming the money was essentially a gift received prior to death, but the deeds on the new will made that impossible. He committed outright tax evasion. But tax evasion alone is hard to prove criminally. Jane and I needed undeniable perjury. We devised a decoy strategy. I hired a low-profile civil litigator to file a minor, almost throwaway claim in state court, claiming Mark had improperly dispersed funds from a separate small trust fund that was outside the main will. The amount was negligible, only about $20,000, but it served its true purpose: to force Mark into a corner. Mark, arrogant and convinced of his untouchable legal standing, didn't hire a high-powered defense. He used a cheap, lazy lawyer. During the discovery process, my civil lawyer requested a sworn affidavit from Mark, detailing his current personal assets and his exact handling of all estate funds since our father's passing. This was the trap. To defeat the minor $20,000 claim, Mark had to lie about the $1.9 million. If he admitted he treated the $1.9 million as a gift, he would expose himself to massive gift tax penalties and contradict the final estate tax filing. If he maintained the lie that the will was legitimate and he handled the inheritance tax correctly, Jane knew the figures he reported to the state court would not match the false figures he reported to the IRS. Mark's lawyer, focused only on the petty state court claim, didn't see the complexity of the federal tax implication. Mark signed the affidavit, detailing his clean financial hands, swearing under oath that his handling of the inheritance was transparent and fully compliant with all state and federal regulations. That signature was the moment Mark officially committed federal perjury on top of the existing tax evasion. With that sworn document in hand, Jane finalized her report. She had definitive proof Mark had intentionally lied to both the state court and the federal government regarding his acquisition and valuation of the $1.9 million estate. This wasn't a mistake. It was criminal intent to defraud the Internal Revenue Service.
I didn't send the report to the state court. I didn't send it to the probate lawyer. I walked into the local IRS criminal investigation field office. I presented them with Jane's 50-page report, the sworn affidavit, and the final estate tax filings. The agent who took the case looked at the complexity, looked at the numbers, and looked at the sheer arrogance of Mark's actions. He simply said, "Mr. OP, thank you for doing our job for us." Mark had won the inheritance battle, but he had just started the war against the U.S. government, and they play for keeps.
The IRS is not like the state probate court. Probate is slow, disorganized, and expensive. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division, known as IRS-CI, is quiet, methodical, and they have nearly unlimited resources for fraud cases. They don't care about family drama. They only care about their money and the integrity of the federal tax system. When I handed over Jane's report, I effectively handed Mark over to the federal government on a silver platter. They already had proof of tax evasion and, thanks to my civil lawsuit decoy, definitive proof of federal perjury, lying under oath on a legally binding financial document. The investigation was swift. Mark never received a grand public summons. One quiet Tuesday morning, 2 Treasury agents showed up at his newly inherited house, the one he had bragged about. They didn't arrest him immediately. They executed a search warrant. They seized his computers, his financial documents, and all the records relating to my father's trust fund. They spent hours turning his life upside down. Mark called me that night, not to apologize, but to rant. He was furious that I would involve the tax vultures over a petty family disagreement. He kept insisting he could fight the IRS and that I was crazy. I simply said, "Mark, you committed federal crimes. I told you I would make you pay." The IRS doesn't immediately file charges. They build a case until it is airtight. They use the threat of charges as leverage. They offered Mark a deal: plead guilty to a single count of tax fraud and potentially avoid jail time, but he would have to pay back the full amount of tax owed, including the massive penalties for fraudulent filing, and legally renounce his claim to the entire $2 million inheritance. Mark, still convinced his cheap lawyer could win against the federal prosecutor, refused the deal. He truly believed they couldn't touch him because he had won in probate court. He failed to grasp that the federal system exists in a completely separate legal universe. The federal prosecutor formally filed charges. Mark was facing up to 5 years in federal prison for the combined charges of tax evasion and perjury, plus fines potentially running into the millions. The trial was not the grand courtroom drama you see in movies. It was quiet and devastating. The prosecution didn't need to prove Mark stole the money. They only needed to prove that he lied about how he reported the money. Jane, my forensic accountant, was the star witness. She walked the jury through Mark's fraudulent filings, showing exactly where he undervalued the assets, failed to report capital gains, and ultimately used the sworn affidavit from my decoy lawsuit to prove his intent to defraud. The fact that he committed perjury to cover up the tax fraud was the final nail in the coffin. The jury deliberated for less than half a day. They found Mark guilty on all counts of federal tax fraud. Mark was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. On top of that, the court ordered mandatory restitution, not to me, but to the IRS, for the taxes and penalties. The final delicious irony:
Because Mark had been convicted of a felony related to financial fraud, the court simultaneously declared his position as executor of my father's estate null and void. The new will, the one he had forged and defended so arrogantly, was legally invalidated because the executor was a convicted felon. I was automatically reinstated as the executor. The $2 million estate, which had been frozen during the federal investigation, was finally dispersed, split 50-50, exactly as my father had intended. I got my inheritance, and Mark went to a place where he couldn't spend a single cent of his stolen money. My lawyer called me afterward. He asked if I was satisfied. I told him, I didn't just want my money back. I wanted justice against a man who desecrated my father's wishes. He didn't just lose the money, he lost his freedom. That's a price only the federal government can extract. Mark served his time and was released last year. He has crippling debt from the IRS penalties and can never hold a financial position again. The question I leave you with is this. Was sending my own brother to federal prison over money a morally acceptable form of revenge, or was it simply the only way to ensure true justice was served? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below.